We had a request that someone would like to see or know how to do the bread with the yeast off the grapes. So I'm going to give you two options. I'm going to give you the long make, which makes a good sourdough, and it'll take a little bit longer. And I'm going to do the short make, which is just going to be basically for proving that you can indeed make a dough rise with just flour, grapes, and water and nothing else. But for the finished product, when we get towards the end, I'm going to add some olive oil and some salt before I bake it so that you'll enjoy eating it more. And so you're going to need bread flour. You're going to need grapes from the grocery store. You can rinse them, but don't wash them. You're going to need water, cold water. You are going to need some olive oil, and you're going to need some salt. So to begin this process, you need to know that it's going to depend on how warm your climate is as to how long this process will take. My first loaf of bread took 30 hours to rise. And sorry about that, it took 30 hours to rise. But now the second loaves that I have done, this will be my third one, it's taking a lot longer because our temperatures are in the 90s. If I put the grapes, flour, and water together in the morning at our temperatures now, I have a yeasty, they basically call it a sponge. I have a yeasty sponge by early afternoon, so it's really fast. So it's going to totally depend on your climate, how long it's going to take for your grapes to make yeast in your flour. And the thing that you're doing, just so you'll know the process, is when you're bursting the grapes, you're exposing the sugar inside to the yeast on the outside of the grape skin, and you're putting it down in the flour and the water, and the yeast of the grape is literally feeding off the meat of the grape and the flour and causing this to rise as it goes along. So let's get started, and let's figure out if we can explain to you how we're going to make this yeast from grapes. So I've also never used this process in creating a video before, and I apologize, it's probably going to be pretty rough, but it is what it is. So what you're going to do is, you can see we're on there on the countertop. I've got bread flour. I took 4 grapes and I squished the grapes right on top of the flour. I've got 1 cup of bread flour and I've got 1 cup of water. And what you're going to do is you're going to put all the ingredients, which you can't tell, but the bread flour and the grapes are laying on a piece of wax paper. I'm going to pour it over into that big canning jar, and I'm going to add the cold water, and then I'm going to stir it. And I'm not going to try to get it smooth. It can be a little lumpy. It doesn't matter, because in 24 hours the lumps are going to be gone and you're never going to know. So just give it a good stir and try to mix it, and you're going to put all that in the jar. You can put a lid on it and shake it if you want, but you're not going to leave the lid on it because the bacteria or the yeast on the grape needs to breathe. Now I want to say, if you're wanting a sourdough bread for the taste, then you're going to want to do this 3-step, 3-day process. But if you're just proving to yourself that the yeast on the grapes and the grapes themselves with flour and water can rise bread, then you're going to go ahead and measure 3 cups of flour, 3 cups of water, and about 8 grapes is all you're going to need. So let's pretend like we're making the sourdough. So tomorrow, I always give it a day. Tomorrow you're going to see it's bubbly and it smells sour and pungent, and it's raised in the jar, and even the water may have separated out of the flour, and you may have a thin layer of water on the top. That's perfect. That's fine. Tomorrow you're going to add another cup of flour, bread dough flour, 4 more grapes, squish them, drop them down in there, and another cup of water. And you're going to stir this and give it another 24 hours. So now you're 48. So now I've put my batter over into the jar and I've stirred it. And what you see is a coffee filter with a rubber band just to secure it in place. to keep the fruit flies out, because it is a fermentation process. And if you've ever been around fermenting food like fruit, you know the fruit flies are drawn to that smell. So this just lets the batter breathe, and it can do its work without letting bugs in. Okay, this is the third day, and I've moved the contents of the jar, over into a bowl. And I want to tell you right here that if you wanted to add a little bit of sugar and a little bit of flour to thicken it up, you could put this in a skillet and fry it like a sourdough pancake. There's nothing to keep you from it at that point. You also probably would want to add an egg to it. But at this point, you can make pancakes from it. I put it in a larger bowl, so it's going to be easier for me to work with, as I'm going to be adding 2 cups of flour and 1 cup of water for our third day of souring the dough before we actually form the loaf that we're going to bake off. So you've just moved into a big bowl, so you've got room to work with the dough. If you did this inside the jar, then you're going to have a hard time scraping everything out of that neck of the jar and into an area you can work with it. So again, this is the same sponge that I put over in the bowl. I've added 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of water. I've mixed it up, and this will be what you make dough with on the following day. You're just going to cover it with a towel, leave it on the kitchen countertop, and let it do its magic overnight for 1 more day to get that really tangy sourdough bread that my husband loves. Sorry for the lack of personality in this video, but I'm learning a new muscle as I'm teaching you about bread. Okay, so in this bowl, we're going to start adding the flour. I'm going to add 1 cup of flour first. And you can see I've drizzled about a tablespoon of olive oil and about 2 teaspoons of salt in the dough. And I'm going to mix this first while it's still soft throughout the dough before I start getting a stiffer batter. Eventually, on this batch, I ended up adding about 2.5 cups more of flour to the actual dough in order to get it the consistency I wanted. Every region, every day is different, especially when you're making bread. If it's more humid, you're going to need more flour. If it's drier, you're going to need less flour. That's just the nature of bread making. So you're going to have to just manipulate your batter until you're happy with the outcome. And I'll show you here that what it looks like after I added the 2nd cup of flour to this 1st cup. So now we added 2 cups yesterday, 1 cup of water. Now we've added 1 cup of flour and the oil and the salt, and I'm going to mix it around, and you're going to see in the next clip that we're going to need 1 more cup of flour until we get where we're going with the batter. Okay, this is after I've added the next cup of flour. It's not a very clear picture, but you can still see that the dough is starting to clean the sides of the bowl just a little bit. And there's still some sticking a little bit, but it's starting to make something that you can manipulate and knead into a bread. And you're not going to have to do a lot of kneading on this, because we're going to rely on the glutens that have been sitting around for 3 days to have already well developed themselves in this case. So we'll go on to the next. So in the next picture, you can see that the dough is got it on the countertop. I floured the countertop, and I've started working in the extra. I think I used 2.5 cups this time to finish off the bread. And you can see that it's starting to clean itself pretty good, but it's still sticking. What we want is we want a wet dough, because we're also going to rely on the steam in the dough when we cook it to help finish rising it as high as we can get it. So this will be what you're looking for, a dough that you can manipulate, but not a dough that completely cleans the countertop or your hands as you're kneading it. By the way, the grapes are still in the dough. I never took them out. What you're going to do now is flatten the bread all the way out and like to about a 12 by 8, and then you're going to fold the long ends into the middle, just like you see in the picture. Okay, you're beginning to shape the dough into the loaf now, into the shape of the bread. So fold it in thirds towards the center. Now you're going to fold the ends that you hadn't previously folded towards the center. So you folded it like a square basically, and you're going to flip it upside down on the counter so that all your folds are on the bottom of the dough. And then the next thing we're going to do is score it. So now we've scored it and we've let it rest an hour and a half covered. You can see I've got it on a baking peel because I'm going to want to move it from my location. You can use a towel, but you want to put it down in a lot of flour on a towel, on a piece of wax paper, and score it, cover it, let it rest an hour and a half. Then at the last, for the last half hour, you're going to need either a Dutch oven. I'm using an enameled cast iron casserole pan, and we're going to heat the oven to 400 degrees and your cast iron with it because we're going to pour it over and bake it in there covered. Okay, so on the left I've got a Dutch oven. I don't have a lid for it, but if I wanted to use it, I'd put a cast iron skillet upside down over on it, invert it. On the right I've got my cast iron enamel casserole pan. But again, you're going to put whatever you're using in the oven as you preheat, and preheat at 400 degrees for 30 minutes because you're going to take this baking implement back out of the oven, and we're going to then flip the bread upside down into the container. And yes, it's going to look like a mess. When you flip it, just give it a shimmy shake and settle it all down in there, and it's going to come out perfect. Don't worry about it. The scoring we did before was to give the bread room to breathe and rise. And yes, it's going to be on the bottom, but it's going to have served its purpose. Again, don't worry about it. So you're going to, and when you heat it, then now the next thing we're going to do is take it back out of the oven and flip the dough up. And this is my dough flipped upside down in my enameled casserole dish, little Dutch oven make-do. I'm going to put the lid on this and put it right back in the oven, and it looks like a mess, but you're going to see at the end it ends up just beautiful. So don't be afraid when you flip it upside down. Yes, it's going to deflate. Yes, it may fold a little bit like mine did, but when you get done, it's going to be beautiful. You're going to put the lid back on this. You're going to put it back in the oven. You've got it at 400 degrees. You're going to bake it at 50 minutes. You're not going to bother it. You're not going to take the lid off. You're not going to look in the oven. You're just going to put it in there. You're going to shut the door, and you're going to bake it for the full 50 minutes. Then when the 50 minutes is up, you're going to take it out of the oven again. And you're going to want to flip it over on a board so that you can take the bread out of the pan. Then just go ahead and put the bread back in the oven and finish baking it for 15 more minutes to get the good brown color like you see there. My husband does not like any kind of light colored bread. He wants it good and brown. That's just the way that, you know, he likes his bread. This bread will be heavy, will be dense, will be tangy, will be chewy, will be crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. If you want a softer crust, as it begins to cool down, and I mean when it is just barely warm to touch, not when it's hot, after probably about an hour or more, you have to check it. Wrap it in saran wrap, and the heat that's inside the dough will soften the crust. If you like that crunchy on the outside, chewy, hard to tear, biting, you know, heavy bread of substance, then leave it just like it is and slice it up this way and eat it. I hope you enjoy it.